and welcome to Suffen About Suffolk, a podcast where we deep dive into the county of Suffolk. In episode 5, we bring our time with the Anglo Saxons to a close. But before we say goodbye, let's check back in with Tim, Philip and Alan, who all separately brought up the same topic.
Other things that Anglo Saxons and also Norse mythology has that we have to thank it for is of course 99.9% of all modern fantasy, and you know, I grew up, well, my dad read me The Hobbit at a very, very young age, and if you look at the Dusts cover or the maps that are inside, there are all these runic messages in Dwarvish. And although Tolkien later did, of course, famously invent his own languages and his own rune system, Dwarvish is just the Anglo-Saxon alphabet. And so, you know, when I was really, really young, I could already write Anglo-Saxon runes without even knowing it. I just knew it as Dwarvish, you know.
That's amazing.
Which was really handy.
Yeah.
Because now I'm like, you know, in the museum, and I can write people's names and stuff, and they go, whoa, that's amazing. And depending on how sort of bashful I'm feeling, I can either say yes, or I can go, well, yeah, to me I just sort of learnt it as Dwarvish, but don't tell anyone. Yeah, I mean, you just look. I mean, I've been reading some stuff about sort of Norse mythology, really, because it is the closest we've got to sort of written accounts of Anglo-Saxon, what their beliefs were pre-Christian. And you know, it's talking about dwarves called Dwalin and Durin, and you're just like, well, hey, hang on a minute, you know, that's kind of familiar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny that I because of Tolkien, there's so much about Anglo-Saxons that I was kind of primed for and inherently kind of loved, that when I started working with Anglo-Saxon, it kind of reawoke all of this knowledge that I kind of had. I mean, some of it wasn't quite right, of course, you know, it had a kind of dwarvish spin on it or whatever, but yeah, it all just really kind of
were there. Yeah,
it all kind of really clicked, and I think that's a great way to introduce people. I mean that what Tolkien wanted was exactly because, as I say, there is no mythology of that kind for our country. What the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and the Silmarillion were an attempt to do was to create that mythology. And when you sort of know that, and you know the genuine historical stuff, you can see the parallels in the way that he writes. And it's, yeah, I mean, for me, most of these books, you know, there is some historical stuff there, but all of the big side of my bookshelf is mostly kind of fantasy and stuff like that. And it's certainly a kind of gateway drug, if you will, into
it's a real history.
Into history. Yeah.
One of the reasons that I'm a Lord of the Rings nut is because Lord of the Rings, Tolkien was mad about the Anglo-Saxons. And the things that we've been talking about, Tolkien, just to give you one good example, Tolkien was, like me, amazingly brassed off that we lost the Battle of Hastings due to a number of minor factors. So in Lord of the Rings, the Rohirrim are the best cavalry you've ever seen, so that he can duff up the Normans. And it's all this sort of thing that Tolkien's fantasy Anglo-Saxons, and in the film and in the book, they actually speak Anglo-Saxon, the Rohirrim. And so much of the whole Lord of the Rings thing, the whole thing about rings is Anglo-Saxon and Northwest European stuff. But he just adds a fantasy touch to it and regurgitates it in this new sort of fictional form that has got so much of the original Anglo-Saxon mentality, attitude in there, that is just amazing. You know, this whole thing of, for Frodo, you know, when we go in there at the end, and Viggo Mortensen is one of my heroes next to Sean Bean, they do things because they're the right thing to do. And good is right and bad is bad, and the goodies should win. Whereas Battle of Hastings, the baddies win and the Vikings win. So it's all this sort of, Tolkien is taking these Northwest European ideals and ideas and wrapping them up in something which people say, yeah, Lord of the Rings is fantastic, big fan following. And they don't realize that actually it's just history, just slightly readjusted for an audience.
So I always thought the hobbits were the Suffolk representation, but actually it's the Rohirrim.
That's right. And the other thing that you may be interested in is that Tolkien was such an Anglo-Saxon nerd that in the films that they're riders of the Mark. Mark is Mercian dialect Anglo-Saxon for Mercia. So it's what the people of the Midlands, Tolkien, like me, I'm a Brummie, came from the Midlands. That's why I love Tolkien. He's a Brummie. Came from the Midlands, and he has his Anglo-Saxons speaking not just ordinary Anglo-Saxon or Wessex brackets King Alfred Anglo-Saxon. He has them talking a Mercian dialect, a Brummie Midland dialect, and of Anglo-Saxon. He's that much of a nerd about the whole thing, which is absolutely fascinating. He went into it in that much detail, And we built a Hobbit house when I was still in charge of Westow. We built a Hobbit house at Westow. I do tours on Lord of the Rings and how much Anglo-Saxons in it. And I was also down in Westow Village. Westow Pods have built a Hobbit house, and I helped them get that right and do some things with them. And we do a Ring Quest event every year in February. This is the first year we haven't done it in 12 years. And I'm dressed up as a ranger on that, because the other thing I like about rangers is they care for the environment as well as looking after people, and that's right up my street. I have to wear a wig for that though, otherwise I'm not acceptable. And I also do archery, and rangers are good archers, and I use my longbows and things like that. So there's lots of links between these Anglo-Saxons and the Lord of the Rings and our little part of Suffolk as well.
And so were the Anglo-Saxons, because the thing about the Rohirrim that's so thingy about them is that they are horse people. They're all about the horses. It's all on their flags. Yes. So was that a Tolkien sort of twist where he was like, I need to make them really good at something, or were Anglo-Saxons horse people?
Both. Tolkien was the cleverest man in the world, okay? And in terms of language, he was almost unsurpassed. Have you heard about, what you were taught at school in history about Hengist and Horsa, the first Anglo-Saxons? Have you ever heard of those?
It rings a bell.
Rings a bell. Well, when I was at school, half a millennium ago, we were told that the first Anglo-Saxons were called Hengist and Horsa, because that's what traditional stories like the Chronicles of Wessex, written by Alfred, who was trying to back project his own story to go back to the origins of his people. And beyond that, he wanted all the Anglo-Saxon kings were directly related to Woden, to establish their right to be kings. And along that little route, you've got the semi-mythical. The historians give the name of the first Anglo-Saxons. They call them Hengist and Horsa. Now, even you will know, what does Horsa mean?
Horse?
What does Hengist mean? It means horse through a different word root.
Oh. So
even though the Anglo-Saxons were famous for dismounting from their horses, because that was it was cowardly to stay on a horse. You had to stand toe to toe with your enemy on the ground. Their myth and origin is with people who are named after horses and horse people. And that's why Tolkien takes that from the language root that he uses. Isn't that amazing?
I literally love that. The Two Towers was always my favorite because we spent so much time in Rohan, and Eowyn is like obviously the best character ever, and I had no idea that it was all Anglo-Saxon, and it makes so much sense now. Like, it's so obvious now, but I was so caught up with the idea that the Shire was Suffolk that I was like, Rohan is probably just like generic history. But of course that generic history is Anglo-Saxon. Oh my God, that's made me so happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Spot on. And I mean, the Shire is about as brummy as you can get. I mean, I've actually been, there's a Shire country park in Edgbaston, and I've actually been to where Tolkien, because I'm a Tolkien nut, spent his childhood. And he was born in South Africa, and then he came over to this country. And he spent his childhood in the Midlands before it became the Midlands now. And those places where he spent his childhood were wonderful, green, rural places. And that's how he wants to remember his childhood. And they're solidly placed in sort of the middle of the country, and Warwickshire and Worcestershire and this Mercian dialogue. But it's this fascinating interrelation between, as you were saying in your bloggy bits, how we as modern people perceive the past, how Tolkien, as a relatively not up to date, but a relatively modern author, uses the past, and how was it really like in the past, and how many things have we got right and how many things we've got wrong. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I love it.
There are all sorts of runes, but we're talking Anglo-Saxon runes that he chose for that. And we've got runes on the houses at Westow. And our Ring Quest family quiz is all about runes and what that means. But the weird thing is that there's no runes from Westow. And there aren't that many runes because, they're designed to be cut into hard materials. And a lot of it was wood and it's rotted away. They've got like this magic significance, the runes, they're just absolutely amazing in what they look like. And the fact that, unlike our modern alphabet, we spell all our words. But if you take the example of Tew, the god of war, one of the most commonly found runes is the Tew rune. And it's like a letter T with the top bit like the roof of a house. Instead of the letter T being flat, it's sort of at an angle. That's the Tew rune. So it looks a bit like an arrow, okay? The god of war. And by the way, what is the modern war department? Well, the Second World War department symbol was an arrow. And that symbol actually came from my archery background from the 100 Years' War, because the one thing that this country had to make by the million were arrows. And back in medieval times, the country's arrows were stored in bags, and the symbol that the country used at the Tower of London to say these are ours was an arrow, because they were full of arrows. So you can see from rune to arrow to war department, it's that same symbol. But the Tew rune can be a rune on its own. It means Tew, god of war, I enlist your help to help me in my battle and make me overcome enemies. Just one rune can mean that whole thing. And at the same time, you can use it to spell out sentences. So it's this weird idea that they have value on their own, but at the same time, you can use them like an alphabet, which is fascinating stuff. Fascinating.
Cool.
JRR Tolkien was an expert on Anglo-Saxon literature. He was a professor at the University of Oxford. And so his sort of day job was studying Anglo-Saxon and medieval history. But in his sort of spare time, he wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, of course. And these are very much based on, if not actual Anglo-Saxon stories, they're based on the sort of Anglo-Saxon mindset. So the whole thing about the ring in The Lord of the Rings being a magical and powerful object is is drawn from Anglo-Saxon mythology, as indeed are the swords. I mean, the swords in the Lord of the Rings have names, don't they? And they almost have personalities, and that's very much our understanding of how an Anglo-Saxon warrior would regard his sword. And I suppose the idea also of mythical creatures like the dragon in The Hobbit. I mean, the dragon is probably one of the best characters in it, actually, if you think about it. And the dragon is again really sort of based on Anglo-Saxon and medieval mythology. And this idea of the dragon's hoard of treasure is all, it sort of really comes out of things like Beowulf and so on. It's all there really in the Anglo-Saxon stories. But Tolkien's great genius was to take these elements and construct amazing adventures for children, for everybody actually.
And if you love Lord of the Rings, once restrictions are lifted, there's plenty to sink your teeth into at Westow. Whether you want to stay in a full-sized replica of a Hobbit house, or join the Ring Quest to find rings, runes, and save Middle-earth. More details are in the show notes of this episode. One of the sites that we mentioned in previous episodes was the one at Rendalsham, which was discovered in 2016. Here's Philip to tell us more.
So basically, Rendalsham is a very important site for Anglo-Saxon studies, not just in Suffolk or East Anglia or even in England, but internationally. And the reason it's so important is that it's a royal site. You could almost say it's a royal palace site, on the basis that one of the things which we now know exists there is a very large timber building or hall. And these sorts of buildings were used by the Anglo-Saxons for feasting. And feasting is really important in Anglo-Saxon society. It's where, let's say, the king, or the chief perhaps, entertains his supporters, those warriors that follow him and benefit from his success and benefit from his importance and power. And a poem, for example, like Beowulf, which is an epic poem written in this period, describes feasting going on in a similar sort of timber hall to that which is seen at Rendlesham. And then around the hall, there are other buildings and other activities taking place, particularly in relation to metalworking. So there were metalsmiths at Rendlesham who are working in both sort of base metals, copper, for example, and tin, but also working in precious metals, gold and silver. So it's the centre of a very economically significant estate. There's also evidence of foreign trade. So some amongst the finds made at Rendlesham are examples of jewellery which are made in Western Europe. And one of the most fascinating things for me is something that perhaps to the casual observer you'd overlook. And that is that there are 4 bronze coins which were actually minted in Constantinople, modern Istanbul in Turkey. And at this period, in the sort of 7th, 8th century, Constantinople is the capital of what had been the Eastern Roman Empire and is now the Byzantine Empire. So it's the successor to the Roman Empire, and it's still a sort of force to be reckoned with. And of course, if you think about it geographically, the distance between Suffolk and what is now Turkey is very great. But through various hands, these coins have passed from one end of Europe to the other, and that, I think that's really interesting in terms of the connectedness of Europe, and the fact that there were traders and merchants moving around the continent. The other thing to say about Rendlesham is that it relates directly to two other sites in Suffolk, one being Sutton Hoo. So the kings who are buried at Sutton Hoo, including that found by Basil Brown in 1939, they lived in Rendlesham. So really close connection between the royal site at Rendlesham and the royal burial ground of the East Anglian kings at Sutton Hoo. And then the other thing is that the kings who were living at Sutton Hoo were the first to develop Ipswich as a port. So Ipswich is the port by which these foreign items of jewellery and pottery and other items are coming into Suffolk. And the reason that it exists is directly as a result of the activities of the Anglo-Saxon kings at Rendlesham, because it's one of the main reasons why they are powerful. They control this trade to the continent, and they control the commodities that are coming in, and they sort of make their money, if you like, from that trade. And so Ipswich as a town owes its origins to the Anglo-Saxon kings of East Anglia, and in that sense, you could almost argue was a sort of royal town, if you wished.
So we really are a hotspot of history here in Suffolk. But what eventually happened to the Anglo-Saxons? Here's Tim to tell us. Tim, where did the Anglo-Saxons go?
It's actually one of the easier questions to answer. Is they didn't really go anywhere. They just had, if we look at the the analogy I used before of a blender, of the Romans kind of leaving, but there's still a little bit of Rome left in the kind of bottom of the blender, and obviously all the Iron Age Britons you had there before. But Rome would have brought people from other parts of their empire as well. So you've got quite a lot of little bits and pieces there. But then you get this big injection of these Germanic tribes, from Germany, Denmark, and Holland, and so on. And then later still, you have the sort of Norse coming from a bit further up north, and that's all being sort of whooshed around and is still kind of essentially called Anglo-Saxons. But what happens in 1066, of course, is you have the Normans coming over, and they win famously, of course, as seen on the Bayeux Tapestry, and they take over the country, and so you start to get an influx. That's where you kind of get the French. I mean, that you can look at it as well from our language, because if you look at Old English, which I've been trying to kind of teach myself a bit of, it is, if you can speak German really well, which I can't, but my wife can, and you speak English, you can recognize so much of both languages in Old English, but then you'll find a word where you're like, well, what is that? And then it's French. It's, the Norman French, which came in 1066. So in 1066, you get that chucked into the blender. And at that point, it's interesting, really. I suppose it was just because, like I said, the Anglo-Saxons hadn't gone anywhere. They're still there in the blender.
Yeah.
But now they're being ruled by Normans, and their sort of day-to-day life probably didn't change very much. It's just who they paid their taxes to.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the Normans brought with them certain technologies and, fashions and so on. But really, that's all they did. And the Anglo-Saxons carried on all the way through the medieval period and on until you get to us, really. So they didn't really kind of go anywhere. They just got conquered.
Yeah. And finally, back to Philip to talk about the future of Anglo-Saxon Suffolk.
There will always be new things to reveal about Anglo-Saxon Suffolk. I don't think we've got to the end of the discovery stage yet. And in Ipswich, for example, there are things that we definitely don't know, and things that it would be really interesting to find out. I mean, for example, we've always assumed that the centre of, well, the town had two sort of centres. So one is the waterfront, where there have been a number of excavations, and the other is up on the Cornhill. And as far as I'm aware, there hasn't really been that much excavation on the Cornhill itself. But it's there where we think there was a very early Anglo-Saxon church, so it'll be interesting to find that and see what that looked like, and see if we can sort of confirm the extent of the town. I mean, we do know quite a lot, definitely, about Anglo-Saxon Ipswich. So I wouldn't want people to think we don't know anything, but there is more. There are bits of the jigsaw missing, if you see what I mean. And that will be true for elsewhere in Suffolk as well. That there are probably many settlements in Suffolk which date back to the Anglo-Saxon period. And we'll know this because they appear in Domesday, the Domesday Survey of 1086, for example, and because they might also appear in earlier charters. But it's not necessarily the case just because they're in a historical document that you've got actual archaeological evidence for the Anglo-Saxons being there. So on occasions, as the opportunity arises, I'm sure that this sort of evidence will be found, and that we'll find Anglo-Saxon buildings or even Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. So the story is not ended yet, and there'll be plenty to keep archaeologists and historians busy for quite some time.
Suffen About Suffolk will now be coming out on a monthly basis to allow me time to collect information and put it all together for you. If you have a Suffolk subject that you'd like to hear covered on the podcast, get in touch at suffenaboutsuffolk@gmail.com. Next month's episode will be about the 1968 film Witchfinder General that stars Vincent Price. I'll be discussing and reviewing the film with some guests and interviewing the saint himself, Ian Ogilvy, so make sure to tune in on the 23rd of April. Suffen About Suffolk is on Facebook at Suffen About Suffolk, Twitter at Suffen Suffolk, Instagram at Suffen About Suffolk, and on YouTube. If you enjoy the podcast, you can head to ko-fi.com/Suffen About Suffolk and show your support for the price of a cup of coffee. All links are in the description. All the music you heard today was composed by the Silburys. You can follow them on Twitter at SilburysThe and hear more of their music at www.thesilburys.com. If you're looking for some more podcasts, you can come join me over at Why This Film Podcast, where I look back at the movies of your childhood. And coming soon, you can tune into Through Dangers Untold, a podcast where I'll be breaking down the 1986 film Labyrinth scene by scene. For now, thanks for listening. Mind how you go.